Good morning. My name's Reverend Elizabeth Moseley, and I am one of the associate ministers here, and it's a joy to be with you to enter into this worship series that we've been in on the book of Job to fill in this week while Mitchell, our senior minister, is on a special study leave so that he can prepare sermons moving forward for all of us. It's really good to be with you this morning, and I'm grateful for this time and this space and for our community here. We've been in a worship series called Band on the book of Job, and it's a teaching series, which is why we're a little more casual. It's also super hot outside, so we're showing up kind of as we are. We know that folks are traveling. We know folks are in and out of town. This is a chance for us to kind of just take a breath and be together and really dig into this book, because this text is not easy. This text is not easy. But it's so good. Have you ever been lonely? I don't just mean alone. We all are alone sometimes, and some of us actually really like being alone. And those of us who don't like being alone, extrovert here, even we need alone time. So I'm not talking about just like being alone. I'm talking about really being lonely. That feeling of being isolated and totally by yourself. Have you ever been really lonely? The loneliest that I have ever been is during my junior year of college when I studied abroad. It was a really amazing, incredible experience. I wanted to go. I would actually encourage everyone to study abroad if you can. It's such a great way of kind of learning about yourself and getting to know a whole new part of our world. Studying abroad was great. And I knew some people who were going on the program with me, but I pretty much went kind of on my own. I didn't know very many people who were going to join me in the program. And so I went. And it was good, but it was a foreign country. I studied abroad in England. And, I knew, like I said, some people, and I had kind of made a few friends. In fact, I joined the rugby team at the college where I went. It was a blast, but it was still kind of early on. And I got injured playing rugby, surprise, surprise. And I was actually stuck in my room for really 2 or 3 days. I was stuck in my room. I really couldn't walk very well. It was a single room. And like I said, looking back, I'm like, surely I could have reached out to somebody or called somebody, but at the time, it didn't feel like I could. And so truly after about 2 days of being by myself, solid in my room, really unable to move, I was hungry. And this was way before, you could just order food and have it brought to your doorstep. And so I remember I got up and I hobbled down this hallway and kind of this shared apartment, kind of dorm space, and I went to our shared kitchen, and I got a can of tuna. And this is true. We did not have a can opener. This is so sad. I can't believe but you've already seen that TikTok video of me trying to shoot the promo for this, so what do I have to be embarrassed about now? So I took a knife and I literally sawed open a can of tuna fish, and I folded back the can lid, and I ate the tuna straight from the can. And I was like, wow, I'm really lonely. I was really lonely. That was a low moment for me in that part because I wanted someone to be with me. It wasn't even enough to call my parents on the calling card. Remember those cards you had to dial in long distance calls? It wasn't enough because I didn't need to just talk to someone. I needed to be with someone. I needed someone to hug me. I needed someone to pry the can of tuna out of my hands and give me a real meal. I needed to be connected. I will never forget that feeling of loneliness. And it got better. It got better. I made good friends. I worked at a pub. We, played rugby. I traveled all over with classmates. It was a really wonderful year, but I have never forgotten that feeling of loneliness because it has a serious impact on us, loneliness does. It has a serious impact on us individually and, ironically, collectively, because, it's actually, we're able to be lonely when we're in a group of people. That's actually possible. We're able to be around people and still feel alone. And that's because we need not just to be next to someone, but we need to be seen by people. We need to be understood by people. We need to feel like someone gets us. We need to be connected. We need to be in relationship with people. We need people. It's how we were created to be. And we especially need to feel seen and connected and understood. We especially need to be with people when we are suffering. When things are bad. When we're really sad, when we're eating tuna fish out of a can, that's especially when we need to feel like we're not alone. Because, as the popular modern philosopher, who was also an American in England, Ted Lasso, says, there is something worse out there than being sad. And that is being sad and being alone. Will you pray with me? Gracious God, be with us now. And let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you. For you are our rock and our redeemer, and we love you. Amen. I love the book of Job. It's always, honestly, weirdly been a favorite of mine. I've just been fascinated with it. I've always been kind of interested in what happens and how things play out. But I really got deeply engaged with it when a friend of mine invited Neil Moseley to lead a Bible study for her and a small group of her friends. You see, she really wanted to study this book of Job, this book that deals with suffering, because she had lost one of her sons to cancer the year prior. And so she knew something about suffering. And she wanted to dig into this book. And so she invited Neil to help her and a small group of her friends dive in and work through it together. And Neil, knowing that I was fascinated by this book of Job, invited me to also be a part of it. Now, Neil now is my husband, but at the time, we were not dating. We were just kind of friends, colleagues, had both studied in seminary, and he knew that I was fascinated by this, so he invited me to join him in this study. And the whole time, we just argued. We did. We argued about what the book said. We argued about what it meant. We argued about the different parts of it. And every single woman in that Bible study knew that something was up before we did. And we invited them all to our wedding. And so what I'm saying is, studying the book of Job may make you fall in love. I don't know. There's something powerful about diving into this material. There's something powerful here. Now, I love the book of Job, but I love it like some people love a really good workout. It's going to be hard, but you want to do it anyway, and it feels good at the end. I love the book of Job. Again, I don't know why I'm just putting all my embarrassing stuff out there, but I love the book of Job kind of like I love the movie Armageddon. You're going to ugly cry when you watch it. It's going to be bad. It's going to make you feel all the things that you don't normally want to feel. When the little boy's like, look, Mommy, it's the salesman. And she's like, that's not the salesman, that's your father. And then, Liv Tyler and her hand on the screen, and it goes blank because he likes it. Okay. I watch it every time, and I cry, and I know I'm going to cry, and it's this, big thing, and I, kind of hate it, and I don't want to watch it, but every time I love it, and I want to watch it, because at the end, it's so good. It's so good at the end, and it's so worth it. And this theme song, it's just fantastic. I love this book, but I was so actually nervous to do this sermon series when Mitchell wanted to, because this book is really hard. And it makes you talk about things and feel things that you try not to feel. And it's long, and it's complicated, and it's mysterious, and there's so much that we still really don't know about why it's in the Bible and where it came from. Kind of like Mitchell said last week, we know roughly when it was written, but like within a span of maybe 300 years, we don't really know. And we think we know a little bit about who wrote it, but like not really, because the text is so complicated, and it's almost like within the text, the author made up new words, and then translators have come in and not liked the new words, and so used old words. And so any translation that we have of the book of Job is pretty uncertain. In fact, in a lot of your Bibles, if you read through a lot of the sections of Job, there'll be a little asterisk, and at the bottom it will say, Hebrew uncertain. Like, we don't know a lot of what it says, so any translations we have are pretty much conjecture. It's a lot of guesswork. This book, it just kind of appeared, and it became something, though, that people couldn't put down. It became something that people actually really connected to, even though we don't know a lot about it. Now, every book in the Bible tries to make sense of our world. That's what the Bible is full of, stories that help us to make sense of our world. And the Bible does that by exploring the relationships we have, primarily the relationship we have with God, but also the relationships we have with one another and the relationships we have with all of creation. So we read the Bible still. We talk about this book and the stories that are in it because we're still trying to make sense of our world. We're still trying to understand our relationships. We're still trying to figure out how all of this goes together, how all of this happens, how it works. And the thing that makes Job different than every other book in the Bible is that it presents our relationship with God in a very different and unique way. That's what makes Job different amongst all these other books. That's why we read it. That's why we are willing to wrestle with it, because it's so good and it's so different and it's so hard. The number one thing that makes us want to make sense of our world, the number one thing that makes us feel like we have to make sense of our world is suffering. Because when we suffer, we ask the question, why? Why is this happening to me? Why am I suffering? Why is my loved one suffering? Why is this happening? Why is a making sense question. We ask why to try to understand our world and to make sense of what's happening. Why is a causal question? Because we think that if we can figure out why something is happening, then we can figure out how to stop it from happening. That's why we ask this question, especially when we suffer. Why is this happening? How do I make sense of this? Because if I can figure out the cause, why this is happening, then maybe I can figure out how to stop it from happening. And as we pick up the story of Job from 2 weeks ago, that's exactly what Job was beginning to ask. Now remember, everything was taken from Job. His wealth, his health, his children, all of his possessions. He's sitting, as Leah described earlier, covered in itchy sores, sitting in ash, scratching himself with a shard of pottery. He's struggling. He is suffering. He is in emotional and mental and physical and spiritual anguish. He has sunk as low as he could go. That's where we are. That's where he is. And he is trying to make sense of this because remember, he lives in a world that says if you do good, then God blesses you. But if you do bad, then God curses you. And the world also then implies the reverse of that, which if your life is terrible, then God's cursing you because you must have done something bad. And if your life is wonderful and good and plentiful, then God is obviously blessing you because you did something good. Remember, that's the world that Job lives in. That's how he has always made sense of his world. And all of a sudden, he's having to reckon with that in a brand new way because Job is blameless and upright. We know that as readers. That's the first thing that we're told. And guess what? Job knows that too. And so he is asking why. What is going on? Why is this happening to me? The way that he made sense of his world no longer makes sense. And as he's asking himself this question, as he's starting to wrestle with this, really wrestle with it, 3 friends show up. This is from Job 2. Now, when Job's 3 friends heard of all these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home, Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort him. I love that. It's like 3 friends, all from different places. You can just imagine they're like on a group text. And they text each other like, this thing happened to our friend, and we got to meet up, and we got to go see about him. We got to get together. Come on, guys, from all your different places. And we come together to go visit our friend Job. Here's the next verse. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him. And they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. Now, these are classic signs of mourning. But don't miss this. Look at what they say. Even from a distance, as they see him, they don't recognize him. That's how much Job's suffering has changed him already. That's how much suffering has taken a toll on his body. Friends who maybe haven't seen him in a while show up, and they don't even recognize him anymore. But they join him in his grief, don't they? They tear their clothes, they throw ash on their heads. And here's the next line. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. I just want to highlight that I think, personally, this is one of the most powerful sentences in all of Scripture. And I guess I just want to say, if you don't know what to do when your friend is suffering, and this book of Job is like too long for you to read, like TLDR, this is what you should do. If you have a friend who's suffering, you should go and you should be with them. And you should sit and you should join them and match them in their suffering. And if you do that, just that, listen, they don't say a word. In honor of how great his suffering is, they don't say a word, but they are with him and they join him in his grief. And if you can do that with a friend who is suffering, then you are doing holy and sacred and godly work. Because that's what our God did for us, isn't it? God came to us. God showed up to be with us. God moved into our neighborhood. God took on flesh and humbled themselves even to death on a cross for us. God came to be with us. So don't miss this moment. And I got to tell you, I wish that this is where Job's friends had left it. But they don't. Which is why we have like 39 more chapters of the book of Job. So let's move on. It's actually Job who breaks the silence after 7 days. And when Job starts to speak, it launches into a 39-chapter dialogue between Job and the other characters. So chapter 3 starts all the way to chapter 42. There is a dialogue. And so we change the whole vibe and the whole feel and the whole understanding of this book, because it goes from prose to verse. It goes from this ancient folk tale to original material that the author of this book created and probably inserted into these bookends of folk tale. It goes from narration to dialogue. Now, this author is not just an author, but this author truly is a poet. And I really encourage you to read some of this poetry, even though it's long, even though it's complex. Think of it kind of like Shakespeare, where it's really rich, it's really vibrant, it's really powerful. The poetry and the quality of the poetry connects to the different characters in different ways. They each have their own voice. It's really incredible. It's unlike any poetry that exists in Scripture. It's really complex and really beautiful. So I do encourage you to read it. But we're going to kind of work through it. We're not going to read all of it. We're going to kind of highlight a few things, because there's something that happens throughout that 39 verses of dialogue that dramatically shifts everything and leaves us in this totally new place. Job starts. He breaks the 7 days of silence. And as last week Mitchell mentioned that his speech was dark, and it is. Listen to his words from the first thing he says after 7 days. Let the day perish in which I was born. Why did I not die at birth, come forth from the womb and expire? Why is light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, who dig for it more than for hidden treasures? Job is grieving. He is in so much pain, and he expresses that in a way that only one who has truly suffered, I think, can understand. He is eloquent in his misery. He's extreme, maybe. We read this and maybe we're uncomfortable with it, but he's in the depths of despair. You know who else is uncomfortable with it? His friends. They can't stand it. They can't stand his expression of grief. They can't stand the weight of his pain. It's almost offensive to them, his pain, his suffering. It's almost scary to them. And so they fire back, and they are not kind. And honestly, they're not very smart either. But listen to some of the phrases they utter. Listen, so Job just said what he did, and now this is what his friend replies. This is what Eliphaz replies. Think now, who that was innocent ever perished, or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. Y'all, in what world is this person living in? The innocent have never suffered? Anyone out here feel that that's maybe a little wrong? It really baffles me that they would say that to Job. But remember, that's the formula that they're all living in. They can't let go of that formula. It's what they've always believed. So they keep trying to comfort Job. Listen to what else Bildad says here. How long will you say these things, and the words of your mouth be a great wind? Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert the right? If your children sinned against God, he delivered them into the power of their transgressions. So they insult him, they gaslight him, and then they tell him that his children died because they deserved it. Can you imagine saying something like this to someone that you knew who was suffering? A friend that you traveled a long way to go see? Can you imagine saying this? I mean, maybe you can. Maybe you've heard someone say this to you before. And then there's stuff like this. This is what Zophar says later. For God knows those who are worthless. When he sees iniquity, will he not consider it? But a stupid person will get understanding when a wild ass is born human. Sorry for that. It's donkey. They mock him. They insult him. They're essentially saying that obviously God has seen his iniquity, which is why he's being punished. So they're saying that Job is the one who lacks understanding. And this phrase is Hebrew uncertain, but it's something like we would say when pigs fly, right? A human will gain understanding when a wild ass is born human. No matter what they say, though, no matter how they pile on, Job maintains his innocence. He maintains his innocence. We see it and over again. He says, no, I did not do anything wrong. I do not deserve this. And his friends are shocked. They are shocked. They can't believe that he thinks he's innocent. They can't believe that he's angry about what's happening. So they tell him he's stupid, and they minimize his suffering, and they tell him he should be grateful for it. That he should be grateful that he is suffering, because they cannot let go of their previously held belief that if you do good, you get good, and if you do bad, you get bad. And so they justify this treatment of Job by claiming things like that's how it's always been. By claiming things like older people and wiser people and more faithful people than you have believed this before. This is how it's always been set up. This is God's plan from the beginning. It's all part of the formula. It's all part of the relationship and transactional nature of our covenant with God. This is how it works. You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. They say this over and over and over again. Listen to this text. The gray-haired and the aged are on our side. The gray-haired and the aged are on our side. I will show you, listen to me, what I have seen I will declare. What sages, wise people have told, and their ancestors have not hidden. Those who have gone before us know this. It's how it's always been. Just because you are having experienced Job, they totally dismiss his own experience because it doesn't fit into their formula. Listen to this. Do you not know this from old? Ever since mortals were placed on earth, the exulting of the wicked is short, and the joy of the godless is but for a moment. Ever since creation, ever since the beginning, this is how it's supposed to be. You do good, you get good. You do bad, you get bad. And his friends will not let it go. Now, do traditions matter? Yes. Do our elders have wisdom? Yes, thank God, because I need a lot of it. Should we simply disregard something just because we've done it in the past? Absolutely not. We remember our history. We remember who we are and where we came from. We learn from it, and we're grateful for those who came before us. And we remember that we are part of a long story that started way before we ever came onto the scene and will continue ever since we leave. And we believe that God is always doing something new. God is always doing something new. God is always drawing the circle wider. God is always inviting us to a truer and deeper and richer relationship with God. God is always inviting us to understand and to grow and to change and to wrestle and to make sense of our world. And that includes how we make sense of suffering. And that's what Job is trying to do. Job is trying to make sense of his suffering. He's trying to figure out, why is this happening? Because the old rationale does not work anymore. And instead of letting him work through this, his friends try to shut it down. His friends tell him there's nothing new to figure out. It's like it has always been. Because if he goes down that path, that challenges what they have always known to be true. And that is scary for them. Look, I believe that his friends truly think that they're trying to help. I mean, remember, they have the group text and they show up and they care about him. But I just think we need to make it clear that it's not being a good friend to tell someone who is suffering that they should just accept it because it's part of a big plan that God started in the beginning. It's not okay to tell someone who is suffering that God is using it to refine them and make them depend more on God. It's not okay to claim that it was God who saved one person's life while letting someone next to that person die. It's not okay for a friend to imply that your suffering is because you haven't been as faithful as you should have been. It's not okay for a friend to imply that if only you had prayed more or given more or sacrificed more, then you would be okay. It's not okay to tell someone that they're not allowed to be sad or hurt or angry at their situation. It's not okay to say that their suffering is because God is punishing them for their own sin and transgressions. That is not okay. And I get why the friends say that, because that's how it's always been. And we see that in so many ways, and it's in this book in various times and places, but this is why I love Job, because Job's in here too. And Job says, no. Job rejects all of that mess and says, that is not what being a good friend is. That is not speaking rightly about me and my suffering, and it's not speaking rightly about God and who God is. The friends should have been quiet, but they weren't quiet, and so the conversation goes on, and guys, for 39 chapters, it just escalates. It goes on and on. I mean, and I want to just kind of draw this out a little bit, because that's part of the experience of working through this, of being in this moment with Job, is going through this exhausting conversation that he has over and over and over again, and they all take turns. And so it goes like this: Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar, Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Zophar, Job, Eliphaz, Job, Bildad, Job, Elihu. There's a new friend at the end of this. And every time Job says, no, I'm innocent, this isn't right, this isn't right, this sucks, this isn't right. And his friends say, yeah, but it's your fault. But you must have done something, because God is just, and God wouldn't mess up the arrangement that we have with Job and with God. And Job says, no, and they say yes. And Job says no, and they say yes, and they just pile on and on and on, and it escalates. Let's talk about Elihu for just a second, because it is so random, and if you read this and you're like, who is Elihu? Well, Elihu is a friend who is never mentioned before in the book of Job, ever, in the beginning of Job. He just appears and then is never mentioned after he speaks. He speaks for 6 chapters, okay? He is the most long-winded of all the friends, and scholars think that it was a later addition. Maybe some of Zophar's last set of speeches are attributed to Elihu. Maybe even some of Job's speeches are attributed to Elihu. Anyway, he just kind of appears and then disappears. And honestly, even though it's longer and a little more complex writing, he doesn't say anything new. No matter who is speaking of the friends, they say the same thing. If you get good, if you do good, you get good. If you do bad, you get bad. So Job, this is your fault. That's what his friends say over and over and over and over again. And while I think we all know that you probably shouldn't say those things to your friends, I think if we're honest, those friends say stuff that we actually wish is true, don't we? I'll admit it. I read some of what the friends say every time, and I want it to be true. I want God to reward the righteous. I want God to punish the evil. I want that to be true in my life because, of course, I think I'm righteous. We want it to be true when we're the righteous ones, right? We want to believe that if we're good, we'll be blessed with wealth and happiness and prosperity and good relationships and long life. We want to think also if we're bad, all we have to do is apologize and do a couple of good things, and all of a sudden we'll get blessed again. Because what we actually want is control over our life, isn't it? That's what this is. That's what this equation gives us. That's what knowing why with that framework gives us, is control. Because I want to know that if I do good, I'll get good. That gives me a sense of control. And that's what the friends want as well. And Job is threatening everything that they know, and he is scaring them. They are afraid of what Job's experience is, what his real life is teaching them. And so they resist it, and they push back against it. They argue with his very real, very dark, very troubling experiences because they want to control their life just like we do. But we know that life is more complicated than that. That relationships aren't merely transactional, especially not relationships with God. We know that just because you do good, you don't get good. Because we follow Jesus. We know this because we follow Jesus, who suffered, but not because he did anything wrong. We know that this is not true because we follow Jesus, who was mocked and humiliated, but not because he was guilty. We know because we follow Jesus, who was beaten and crucified, but not because he deserved it. Our relationship with God through Christ reminds us that suffering is not a punishment for not being perfect. Our relationship with God through Christ reminds us that even when we suffer, we are not alone because God has suffered too. Loneliness is the worst. It is such a horrible feeling. And it's so bad when you're suffering. And our suffering tries to lie and tell us that we are alone. But our God says, no, you're not. You didn't deserve this. This is not because you've messed up. And I am with you in it. We need people, we need community, we need friends. We don't need people who try to ignore our suffering and try to talk over it and try to push it to the side. We don't need people who tell us that we deserve the bad stuff that happens to us. We need people around us who see us and understand and are with us in it, who are willing to sit in the ashes. Because as we see, Job is suffering and his friends are there, but he still feels alone. Next week, Mitchell is going to preach about what happens next, about how God actually shows up, finally, and about how this all ends. So I hope you'll come back and join us then. I just want to say this as we go this week. Look, we all know someone right now who is suffering. We know someone who is in the pit. We know someone who is at the very lowest point in their life, who feels sad and feels alone. And if that person comes to you and asks you to do a Bible study on the book of Job, I'm not saying you should do it, but I'm kind of saying you should do it. Because that's what you do when your friend is suffering. You join them, even if it's going to make you cry, even if it's going to be hard, even if it's going to make you feel uncomfortable. You sit and you watch Armageddon with them. And if you are the person who is struggling right now, if you feel like you're in the dark, that you're in the pit, I'm not saying you should invite people to do a study on the book of Job with you, but I'm kind of not saying it. Because we are the church, and I want to invite you to look around. Because like Ted Lasso also said, ain't nobody in this room alone. You are not alone. We are not alone. And so we move forward together with our friends and with our church and with our God. In the name of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen.